The gravel crunched beneath Caleb Jensen's worn work boots as he stepped out of his pickup truck, the evening air carrying the scent of fresh-cut corn and distant rain. There, 20 yards ahead on the empty county road, a figure stumbled forward in the dying light, a young woman in a dark dress, barefoot, with a burlap sack, covering her head like some medieval punishment. His first instinct was to call Sheriff Morrison, but something in the way she moved, careful, frightened, like a wounded animal, reminded him of his own daughter during her worst seizures. The same helpless terror, the same desperate need for someone to understand without asking too many questions. What Caleb couldn't have imagined was that within a week of this roadside encounter, he would be standing before a justice of the peace, exchanging vows with this mysterious Amish girl whose real name he barely knew. The widower who'd sworn never to love again would find himself promising to honor and protect a woman whose past held secrets that could destroy them both. But what dark truth was this girl hiding beneath that sack that would lead to such an impossible decision? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Caleb Jensen had been a different man. He'd wake at dawn to the sound of his alarm clock, the same brass clock Sarah had bought him for their 10th anniversary in Pad, across the cold hardwood floors of their farmhouse in his stocking feet. The morning routine never changed. Coffee first, black and strong, then a glance out the kitchen window at the fields that stretched toward the horizon like a green ocean under the Iowa sky. But that was before the bank notice arrived, before the medical bills stacked up like autumn leaves on his kitchen table, before he'd sold the last of his John Deere equipment to pay for Ella's neurologist appointments and the seizure medication that cost more than most people's mortgage payments. Now, at 43, Caleb found himself behind the wheel of a Peterbilt 379, hauling loads of corn and soybeans across the Midwest instead of growing them. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was transporting the very crops he'd once cultivated with his own hands, watching other farmers' harvests roll past his windshield while his own land lay fallow, leased to his neighbor Tom Kowalski for a fraction of what it had once earned. The transition from farmer to trucker hadn't been easy. His hands, once skilled at operating combines and tractors, had to learn the delicate art of managing 18 wheels and 40 tons of cargo. His body, accustomed to the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest, now adapted to the constant motion of the highway, the endless miles of asphalt that connected one delivery to the next. But it was honest work, and it paid the bills. More importantly, it allowed him to maintain the flexible schedule he needed to care for Ella, his 6-year-old daughter, whose epilepsy had turned their world upside down 2 years ago when Sarah was in the final stages of her battle with cancer. Sarah. Even now, 18 months after the funeral, he could still smell her perfume on the pillowcase beside him when he woke in the middle of the night. He still reached for her hand when he walked through the grocery store, still saved funny stories from his trucking routes to tell her over dinner before remembering she wouldn't be coming home. The wedding ring's a simple gold band, and the engagement ring with its modest diamond sat in the top drawer of his dresser, wrapped in the same tissue paper from the funeral home. He'd tried wearing them on a chain around his neck, but the weight of them against his chest felt like carrying stones. He'd tried putting them away completely, but that felt like erasing her memory. So they remained in the drawer, waiting for some resolution that never seemed to come. Dr. Martinez had been gentle but direct during their last appointment. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, Mr. Jensen. Some people need months, others need years. But at some point, you have to decide whether you're living for Sarah's memory or living for Ella's future. The words had stung because they held truth. Ella needed more than a father who was merely surviving. She needed someone who could show her how to thrive despite the challenges life had thrown at them. Her seizures had become more frequent lately. Stress, the doctor said. Children pick up on their parents' emotional states more than adults realize. Ella was remarkable, really. Despite the epilepsy, despite losing her mother at age 4, despite the upheaval of their changed circumstances, she approached each day with a curiosity and resilience that humbled him. She'd adapted to their new life with the flexibility that only children seem to possess, treating his trucking routes like grand adventures and turning their modest apartment above Murphy's Diner into a cozy home with her drawings and craft projects. Mrs. Kowalski, their neighbor and Ella's unofficial grandmother, had become their lifeline. The 70-year-old Polish immigrant had raised 6 children of her own and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of managing family crises. She watched Ella when Caleb was on the road, teaching her to bake pierogi and telling her stories about the old country that made the little girl's eyes widen with wonder. "You're a good father, Caleb," Mrs. Kowalski would say, her accent still thick after 40 years in Iowa. "But you're trying to be mother and father both. Is not possible. Ella needs to see you happy sometime, not just responsible." The observation had merit, but Caleb couldn't imagine how to get from where he was to where she thought he should be. Dating seemed impossible. When would he find the time? Who would want to take on a widower with a special needs child and a mountain of medical debt? The few women he'd met through Ella's school or the trucking company had been kind enough, but he could see the calculations in their eyes when they learned about the seizures, the medication schedules, the emergency protocols. It was easier to focus on the practical aspects of their life. His trucking route typically kept him within a 300-mile radius of home, allowing him to return most evenings. The pay was decent, and his dispatcher, Mickey Sullivan, had been understanding about the need to occasionally adjust schedules around Ella's medical appointments. The work itself had a meditative quality he hadn't expected. Hours of highway driving gave him time to think, to process the grief and guilt that still ambushed him at unexpected moments. The CB radio chatter provided a sense of community among the drivers, a fraternity of men and women who understood the isolation of the road and the satisfaction of delivering their cargo safely to its destination. Sheriff Morrison had become an unexpected friend during this transition. The lanky lawman had known Sarah since high school and had made it his unofficial mission to check on the Jensen family. He'd stop by the apartment occasionally, usually around dinner time, and Ella would regale him with stories about her day while he helped himself to whatever Mrs. Kowalski had prepared. "You know, Caleb," Morrison had said during one of these visits, "Sarah wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life as a memorial to her. She'd want you to be happy. She'd want Ella to see what it looks like when a man finds joy in his life again." The words had been well-intentioned, but they'd also been premature. Caleb wasn't ready to consider happiness in any form that didn't include Sarah. He was still learning how to function without her, still figuring out how to be a single parent to a child with complex medical needs. But life had a way of presenting challenges when you least expected them. That evening in late September, as he drove his empty trailer back from a grain delivery in Cedar Rapids, Caleb had no idea that his entire world was about to change again. The county road that served as his shortcut home was quiet, as it always was at dusk. The corn was nearly ready for harvest, the stalks standing tall and golden in the fields on either side of the narrow asphalt. He'd driven this route hundreds of times, knew every curve and hill, every farmhouse and barn. It was predictable, safe, the kind of routine that had become comforting in its reliability. The radio played softly classic country that reminded him of the music Sarah had loved, and he was already thinking about the leftover pot roast Mrs. Kowalski had promised to have waiting for him and Ella. The figure appeared in his headlights without warning, a dark shape against the lighter gravel of the road shoulder. At first, he thought it might be a deer. They were common enough in this area, especially at dusk. But as he slowed the truck and the headlights illuminated the scene more clearly, he realized it was a person. A young woman walking barefoot down the middle of the road, and she was wearing some kind of sack over her head. Caleb's first instinct was professional caution. Years of trucking had taught him to be wary of unusual situations, especially on isolated roads. But something about the way she moved hesitant, frightened, like someone who was lost, rather than dangerous triggered a different response. He thought of Ella, of how vulnerable she looked during her seizures, of how desperately she needed someone to understand, without explanation. He thought of Sarah, of how she'd always been the first to help a stranger in need, even when they could barely afford the kindness. And he thought of Dr. Martinez's words. At some point, you have to decide whether you're living for the past or the future. The truck's air brakes hissed as he pulled over to the shoulder, gravel crunching under the massive tires. Through the windshield, he could see the young woman more clearly now. She was small, probably not much more than 5 feet tall, wearing a dark dress that reached her ankles. Her feet were bare and dirty, and the burlap sack that covered her head was tied loosely around her neck, with what looked like twine. Everything about the scene screamed danger, at least complications he didn't need. The smart thing would be to call Sheriff Morrison and let him handle whatever this was. But as Caleb watched the girl stumble slightly and catch herself, he was reminded once again of Ella's vulnerability, of how sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones who can't ask for it. He turned off the engine and stepped down from the cab, his boots hitting the gravel with a solid thud. The evening air was cool and carried the scent of approaching rain. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of a train whistle, lonesome and echoing across the flat landscape. "Miss," he called out, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. "Are you all right?" The girl froze at the sound of his voice, her whole body tensing like a deer caught in headlights. Even through the burlap sack, he could sense her fear, her indecision about whether to run or stay. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, taking a step closer but keeping his distance. "My name is Caleb Jensen. Do you need help?" For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the cornstalks. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she spoke. "Please," she whispered, her voice muffled by the sack. "I don't know where to go." And in that moment, Caleb Jensen's carefully ordered world began to shift in ways he couldn't have imagined. The widower who had sworn off complications, who had built his life around routine and predictability, found himself looking at this mysterious young woman and seeing not a problem to be solved by someone else, but a person who needed exactly the kind of help he was uniquely positioned to provide. He had no way of knowing that this roadside encounter would lead to the most improbable week of his life, culminating in a marriage that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, faith, and the unexpected ways that healing can come to broken hearts. The girl stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, her slight frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. Caleb could hear her breathing quick, shallow breaths that spoke of panic barely held in check. The burlap sack over her head moved slightly with each exhale, and he noticed for the first time that there were dark stains on the fabric near where her face would be. "What's your name?" he asked softly, the way he spoke to Ella when she was coming out of a seizure, disoriented and frightened. "Miriam," came the whispered reply. Then, in heavily accented English mixed with what sounded like German, "Miriam Stoltzfuss, ich bin." She stopped, as if the words were too difficult or too dangerous to speak. Caleb's knowledge of the Amish community was limited, but sufficient to recognize the name and the accent. There were several Amish settlements within 50 miles of here, though he'd had little direct contact with them beyond, occasionally sharing the road with their buggies. He knew enough to understand that a young Amish woman alone on a county road at dusk, covered with a sack, was so far outside the normal order of things that something terrible must have happened. "Miriam," he repeated, testing the name. "That's a pretty name. Miriam, I'd like to help you, but I need to understand what's happening here. Are you hurt?" She shook her head quickly, then immediately winced and raised a hand to her temple. Even through the sack, he could see the gesture of pain. "You are hurt," he said, taking another careful step closer. "Someone hurt you." This time she nodded, a barely perceptible movement that somehow conveyed volumes of pain and shame. Caleb felt something shift inside his chest, a familiar protective anger that he'd felt watching Ella struggle with her seizures, watching Sarah waste away from cancer. It was the rage of a man who understood that the world could be cruel to the most vulnerable people, and that sometimes the only thing standing between innocence and destruction was one person's willingness to step up. "Miriam, I'm going to call someone." 9. The word exploded from her with such force that she stumbled backward. "No police, please, no. They will send me back. They will say I bring shame, that I lie, Her English dissolved into rapid Pennsylvania Dutch, a stream of words that sounded like prayer and panic mixed together. Caleb held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Okay, no police right now. But Miriam, you can't stay out here. It's getting dark, and there's rain coming. You need somewhere safe." "Nowhere is safe," she whispered, and the despair in her voice reminded him of Sarah during her darkest moments, when the cancer had made her question whether fighting was worth the pain. "That's not true," he said with the quiet authority of a man who had seen darkness and found his way through it. "There are safe places, there are good people. You just have to trust long enough to find them." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant rumble of thunder and the rustle of cornstalks in the evening breeze. Caleb found himself thinking of Ella, probably sitting at Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen table right now, carefully coloring in one of her books or helping with dinner preparations. His daughter had learned to trust strangers, doctors, nurses, teachers, because sometimes strangers were the ones who could help when family wasn't enough. "I have a daughter," he said finally. "She's 6 years old. Her name is Ella, and she has epilepsy seizures. Sometimes she gets scared, and when she's scared, she needs someone to help her feel safe again. I've gotten pretty good at helping scared people feel safe." Miriam's head turned slightly in his direction, and he could sense her attention sharpening. "I'm not going to hurt you," he continued. "I'm not going to force you to do anything you don't want to do, but I can't leave you out here. If you'll trust me for just tonight, I can give you a safe place to sleep and figure out what comes next in the morning." "Your wife," Miriam said hesitantly. "She will not mind?" The question hit him unexpectedly, and for a moment he couldn't answer. "My wife died," he said finally. "It's just me and Ella now, and Mrs. Kowalski, she's our neighbor, helps take care of Ella when I'm working. She's a good woman. She'd want to help you too." Another long silence. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, "I have nowhere else to go." "Then come with me," Caleb said. "Just for tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." She nodded, a movement so small it was barely visible, but it was enough. Caleb walked slowly back to his truck, giving her time to follow at her own pace. He opened the passenger door and watched as she approached the massive vehicle with obvious trepidation. "It's big, I know," he said gently, "but it's safe. There's a step here, let me help you." She flinched when he offered his hand, and he immediately pulled it back. "Sorry, you don't have to touch me. Just use the step and the handle. Take your time." It took several minutes for her to work up the courage to climb into the cab, and when she did, she immediately pressed herself against the passenger door, as far from him as possible. Caleb noticed that her feet were not just dirty, but torn and bleeding. She'd been walking for a long time. The drive to his apartment above Murphy's Diner took 15 minutes, but it felt much longer. Miriam sat in complete silence, her body rigid with tension, occasionally making small sounds of distress when the truck hit a bump or when the headlights of oncoming traffic illuminated the cab. She seemed terrified of the modern world around her, the radio, the dashboard lights, even the seatbelt he'd gently suggested she wear. "Almost there," he said as they turned into the small parking lot behind the diner. "Ella's probably already had dinner, but Mrs. Kowalski always makes extra. Are you hungry?" Miriam nodded, then immediately seemed to regret the admission, as if acknowledging her basic needs was somehow shameful. Mrs. Kowalski met them at the back entrance, her weathered face creased with concern as she took in the sight of the young woman in the burlap sack. The elderly Polish woman had seen enough hardship in her own life to recognize it in others, and she immediately shifted into the practical, nurturing mode that had sustained her through decades of raising children and caring for neighbors. "Boże mój," she murmured, then switched to English. "Come, child, come inside. You're safe now." Ella appeared at the top of the stairs, her small face curious and unafraid. At 6, she had the adaptability of childhood and the wisdom that comes from living with uncertainty. Seizures had taught her that sometimes scary things happen to good people, and that the best response was usually kindness. "Daddy," she said, padding down the stairs in her sock feet. "Who's your friend?" "This is Miriam," Caleb said carefully. "She needs a safe place to stay tonight." Ella studied the strange figure with the burlap sack, her head tilted thoughtfully. "Are you playing hide and seek?" she asked with the directness of childhood. For the first time since he'd found her, Miriam made a sound that might have been laughter, though it was muffled by the sack and tinged with tears. "Something like that," Caleb said. "Why don't we let Miriam get cleaned up and have something to eat? She's had a very long day." Mrs. Kowalski took charge with the efficiency of someone who had managed countless family crises. Within minutes, she had guided Miriam to the small bathroom, found clean clothes that might fit, and started heating leftover soup on the stove. Caleb sat with Ella at the kitchen table, trying to explain the situation in terms a 6-year-old could understand. "Is she hurt, like I get hurt?" Ella asked, referring to her seizures with the matter-of-fact acceptance she'd learned to apply to her condition. "Different kind of hurt," Caleb said. "But yes, she needs help getting better." "Then we should help her," Ella said simply, as if the solution was obvious. From the bathroom came the sound of quiet crying, and Caleb found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. This young woman, this stranger, who had appeared on a dark road like something from a fairy tale, was going to stay. Not just for the night, but for as long as it took to heal whatever wounds had driven her to flee into the darkness. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. He had no idea that within days, the simple act of offering shelter would evolve into something far more complex and binding. He had no idea that the girl in the bathroom, washing blood from her hair and trying to make sense of her new reality, would become the catalyst for changes that would transform his understanding of love, faith, and the unexpected ways that broken people can heal each other. All he knew was that she needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. For now, that was enough. The first morning brought unexpected challenges that tested everyone's patience and adaptability. Caleb woke at dawn to the sound of distressed voices from the kitchen, Mrs. Kowalski speaking in soothing Polish mixed with English, and Miriam responding in rapid Pennsylvania Dutch, punctuated by what sounded like apologies. He found them standing near the coffee maker, which was beeping insistently as it finished brewing. Miriam had pressed herself into the corner furthest from the appliance, her face pale with terror, while Mrs. Kowalski tried to explain that the machine was harmless. "She's afraid of the electricity," Mrs. Kowalski said quietly when she saw Caleb. "The lights, the refrigerator, even the faucet, everything that makes noise or has wires." Miriam looked mortified, her hands twisted in the clean dress Mrs. Kowalski had found for Hera, simple blue cotton that hung loose on her small frame. Without the burlap sack, her face was visible for the first time, revealing delicate features marred by a partially healed cut across her left cheek and older scars around her hairline that spoke of more than one violent encounter. "I'm sorry," she whispered in heavily accented English. "I don't mean to be trouble. I can go." "You're not going anywhere," Caleb said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "You're not trouble, Miriam. You're just not used to these things. We'll figure it out." Ella appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She studied Miriam with the frank curiosity of childhood, taking in the visible scars without the adult impulse to look away or pretend not to notice. "Did someone hurt your face?" she asked with characteristic directness. "Ella," Caleb started to admonish, but Miriam held up a hand. "Yes," she said simply. "Someone did." "That's not okay," Ella declared with the moral certainty of a 6-year-old. "People aren't supposed to hurt other people." "No," Miriam agreed softly. "They are not." The exchange seemed to settle something between them. Ella approached without fear, studying Miriam's traditional Amish clothing with interest. "Your dress is pretty." It looks like the costumes in my history book. It's called a cape dress, Miriam explained, smoothing the fabric self-consciously. All women in the community where I lived, we dress this way. Why? Ella asked, settling into her usual chair at the breakfast table. Miriam considered the question seriously. To show that we are separate from the world, to show that we are plain people, not fancy. But you're not plain, Ella said matter-of-factly. You're pretty. A faint blush colored Miriam's cheeks, and Caleb saw something that might have been the ghost of a smile cross her face before she caught herself and looked down at her hands. Mrs. Kowalski served breakfast scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit, and Caleb watched as Miriam ate with the careful restraint of someone who had been taught that taking too much was selfish. When Ella chattered about school and her upcoming spelling test, Miriam listened with the intense attention of someone starved for normal conversation. "Do you know how to read English?" Ella asked between bites of toast. Miriam nodded. "Yes, but not so good. We learn mostly German and Pennsylvania Dutch. English is for—" She paused, searching for words. "For when we must talk to the English people." "English people." Ella looked confused. "But we're American." "That's what Amish people call everyone who isn't Amish," Caleb explained gently. "English means outsiders, people from the modern world." "Oh," Ella processed this information. "So we're English people to you?" "Yes," Miriam said softly. "But you are kind English people." After Ella left for school with Mrs. Kowalski, Caleb found himself alone with Miriam for the first time since bringing her home. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, looking like she was waiting for instructions or judgment. "Miriam," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee and deliberately avoiding the electrical appliances that seemed to frighten her. "You don't have to tell me everything right now, but I need to understand some basics. Are you safe here? I mean, if you stay for a few days, are we putting you in danger?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "The bishop will look for me," she said finally. "And the elders. They will say I must come back, that it is God's will." "But you don't want to go back." "I cannot go back." The words came out fierce and final. "If I go back, there will be more girls, more hurt. And she touched the scar on her cheek unconsciously. "I cannot pretend anymore that it is God's will." Caleb felt that familiar protective anger rising in his chest. "Who hurt you, Miriam?" "Elder Samuel Yoder," she whispered, the name sounding like a curse in her mouth. "He was to be my husband. The marriage was arranged when I was 16. The bishop said it was a great honor, that Elder Yoder was a respected man, a pillar of our community." "And he wasn't?" Miriam's laugh was bitter and broken. "He was a respected man during the day. At night, when he came to my father's house to court me," she shuddered, "he said I must learn to be obedient, that God wanted wives to submit to their husbands in all things, that if I told anyone, I would be shunned for bearing false witness against a righteous man." Caleb set his coffee cup down harder than necessary, the sound making Miriam flinch. "How long did this go on?" 2 years, since I was 17. The wedding was to be next month." She looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. 3 nights ago, he came to my house after my parents went to bed. He said he wanted to make sure I understood my duties as a wife. When I tried to fight him off, she gestured to the scars on her face. He said if I told anyone, he would make sure the whole community knew I was a whore who tempted a godly man. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock. Caleb found himself thinking of Ella, of how he would feel if someone hurt his daughter this way, and the rage that filled him was so pure and white-hot that for a moment he couldn't speak. "You did the right thing," he said finally. "Running away was the right thing. My parents think I am dead," Miriam said, tears starting to fall. "Or worse, they think I am lost to sin and shame. They will not speak my name again. The community will act as if I never existed." "Their loss," Caleb said with quiet conviction. "Anyone who would choose the reputation of a man who hurts women over the safety of their own daughter doesn't deserve to call themselves family." Miriam stared at him, as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "You don't understand. In my world, Family is everything. Community is everything. Without them, I am nothing. That's not true, Caleb said gently. You're sitting in my kitchen, eating breakfast with my daughter, being cared for by my neighbor. You're not nothing, Miriam. You're someone who was brave enough to choose safety over familiarity. That takes incredible strength. She shook her head. I am weak. If I was strong, I would have found a way to stop him without running. I would have found a way to protect the other girls without bringing shame on my family. Other girls? Caleb's attention sharpened. There are other girls he's hurt? Miriam nodded reluctantly. His first wife died in childbirth 10 years ago. Since then, there have been rumors about the young women who work in his house, the girls who help with his farm. But no one speaks of it openly, and those who do, she touched her scars again. They learn to be quiet. Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just about one man's abuse of one young woman. This was about a system that protected predators and silenced victims, a community that valued appearance over truth. Miriam, he said carefully, if someone could guarantee your safety, would you be willing to talk to the authorities, to make sure he can't hurt anyone else? The terror that crossed her face was immediate and absolute. No, you don't understand. If I speak against him, if I break the silence, they will say I am lying. They will say I am trying to destroy a good man because I am shameful and sinful. And even if they believe me, she was shaking now, even if they believe me, I will be excommunicated. I will lose everything, everyone I have ever known. You've already lost them, Caleb pointed out gently. They let this happen to you. They were going to force you to marry the man who hurt you. What kind of family, what kind of community does that to someone they're supposed to love? It was a harsh truth, and he could see it land like a physical blow. Miriam doubled over slightly, wrapping her arms around herself, as if trying to hold the pieces together. I know, she whispered, I know you're right, but knowing doesn't make it hurt less. Caleb moved his chair closer, careful not to crowd her, but wanting to offer what comfort he could. Healing takes time. I learned that when my wife was sick, and I'm still learning it now. You don't have to make any big decisions today. You just have to get through today. She looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude. Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I could be lying. I could be bringing danger to your family. Because, Caleb said simply, when I found you on that road, you reminded me of my daughter during her worst moments. And because Sarah, me wife, she always said that God puts people in our path for a reason. Maybe I was supposed to find you. Maybe you were supposed to find us. For the first time since he'd known her, Miriam smiled a real smile that transformed her whole face and gave him a glimpse of the woman she might become once the fear and trauma began to heal. By the end of the first week, Miriam had begun to find her rhythm in the Jensen household, though not without considerable adjustment on everyone's part. She slept in the small guest room that had once been Caleb's office, but more often than not, he found her in the early morning hours, sitting by the window, watching the sunrise with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to rising before dawn for farm chores. She was most comfortable in the kitchen, where her skills with traditional cooking and food preservation proved invaluable. Mrs. Kowalski delighted in learning Amish techniques for making bread without modern conveniences, while Miriam marveled at the Polish woman's ability to create elaborate meals using gadgets that had once terrified her. She learns quick, Mrs. Kowalski observed one afternoon as Miriam carefully operated the can opener under supervision. Smart girl, just needs time to trust. The world won't hurt her for every little thing. The breakthrough came when Ella suffered a seizure on Tuesday evening. Caleb was in the shower when he heard Mrs. Kowalski calling frantically from the living room. He rushed out to find Ella on the floor, her small body rigid with convulsions, while Mrs. Kowalski tried to remember the emergency protocol Dr. Martinez had taught them. But Miriam was already there, kneeling beside Ella with calm efficiency. She had turned the child on her side, placed a folded towel under her head, and was gently restraining her arms to prevent injury, while speaking in low, soothing Pennsylvania Dutch. "How long?" Caleb asked, dropping to his knees beside them. 2 minutes, maybe 3, Miriam replied, her voice steady despite the crisis. She's coming out of it now. See how her breathing changes? The worst is over. Indeed, Ella's rigid posture was beginning to relax, her breathing becoming less labored. Miriam continued her gentle murmuring, switching between Pennsylvania Dutch and English, telling Ella that she was safe, that the scary part was finished, that her daddy was right there with her. When Ella's eyes finally opened, confused and frightened as they always were after a seizure, the first face she saw was Miriam's, calm and reassuring. "The lady with the pretty dress," Ella whispered, still disoriented. "Yes, little one," Miriam said softly. "I'm here. Your papa is here. You're safe." Later, after Ella had been settled back to bed with her usual post-seizure exhaustion, Caleb found Miriam in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she tried to brew tea without using the electric kettle. "How did you know what to do?" he asked. "My youngest brother, Isaac," she said quietly. "He had the falling sickness, what you call epilepsy. I learned to care for him when our parents were working." She paused, her expression growing sad. "He died when he was 8. The seizures got worse, and we couldn't. The doctors were too far away, and by the time we got him help, it was too late." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry. That's why I knew to help Ella. I couldn't save Isaac, but maybe I can help her." She looked up at him with fierce determination. "She's a special child. The seizures don't make her weak, they make her strong in other ways. I can see it." It was true. Ella had shown remarkable resilience in adapting to her condition, and she seemed to have an intuitive understanding of others who were different or struggling. Her immediate acceptance of Miriam, her matter-of-fact questions about the scars and trauma, had helped the young woman begin to heal in ways that adult sensitivity might not have achieved. "You're good with her," Caleb said. "She trusts you." "Children see truth more clearly than adults," Miriam replied. "They don't pretend everything is fine when it's not, but they also don't make things worse by dwelling on what can't be changed." The seizure incident seemed to solidify something in their unusual household arrangement. Miriam began taking a more active role in Ella's care, learning her medication schedule and seizure triggers. In return, Ella helped Miriam navigate the confusing world of modern conveniences, explaining with 6-year-old logic why the microwave wouldn't hurt her and demonstrating how to use the television remote. But the outside world was beginning to take notice of their situation. Sheriff Morrison stopped by on Friday afternoon, ostensibly for his regular check-in, but clearly curious about the young Amish woman who had been spotted around town. "Caleb," he said carefully, accepting a cup of coffee while Miriam retreated to the kitchen. "I've been getting some questions about your house guest. Nothing official, mind you, but the Amish community is asking around about a missing girl." Caleb felt his protective instincts flare. "She's not missing. She's here by choice." "I'm sure she is," Morrison said diplomatically, "but from their perspective, she's a young unmarried woman living with an Englishman, which raises all kinds of concerns about propriety and religious law." "She's not living with me," Caleb said firmly. "She's living in my house, along with a 6-year-old child and a 70-year-old Polish grandmother. There's nothing improper about it." Morrison held up his hands. "I'm not suggesting there is, but Caleb, these folks have their own ways of handling things, and they don't always align with civil law. If they decide she needs to come back—" "They can't force her," Caleb interrupted. "She's 19 years old. She can make her own decisions." "Can she?" Morrison asked quietly. "Does she have identification, social security number, birth certificate? As far as the state of Iowa is concerned, does Miriam Stoltzfus even exist?" The question hit Caleb like a cold slap. He hadn't considered the legal implications of Miriam's status. Amish children were often born at home with midwives, their births recorded only in family Bibles rather than state documents. If Miriam had never attended public school, never had a job outside the community, never applied for government benefits, she might indeed be legally invisible. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you might want to get her some legal advice. If the Amish community decides they want her back, and if she has no legal standing as an independent adult, things could get complicated fast. After Morrison left, Caleb found Miriam sitting with Ella at the kitchen table, helping her with homework. The domestic scene struck him as both perfectly natural and utterly fragiletto people who had found safety and purpose in each other's company, but whose connection existed in a legal and social grey area that could be disrupted at any moment. "Miriam," he said carefully, "we need to talk about your legal status, your identification, your documentation." She looked up from Ella's math worksheet, her expression immediately wary. "I have nothing. No papers. In our community, such things are not. We keep our own records." "What about a birth certificate? Social security card?" She shook her head. "I was born at home. The midwife recorded my birth in our church records, but I don't think there are government papers." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, beginning to grasp the complexity of their situation. "Miriam, legally speaking, you might not exist as far as the state is concerned. That could make it very difficult to protect you if your community decides they want you back." The fear that crossed her face was immediate and stark. "They can take me, even if I don't want to go?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted, "but I think we need to find out. I think we need to get you a lawyer." "I have no money for lawyers," Miriam said quietly. "You don't need money," Caleb replied. "You need protection. And if there's one thing I've learned from dealing with Ella's medical issues, it's that there are people who specialize in helping when the system doesn't work the way it should." That evening, after Ella had gone to bed, Caleb made a phone call he hadn't made in over a year. Rebecca Martinez, doctor. Martinez's daughter and a civil rights attorney with the ACLU had handled the legal complexities around Ella's medical care and Sarah's estate. She was sharp, compassionate, and utterly unintimidated by bureaucratic obstacles. "Caleb," she said when she answered, her voice warm with genuine affection. "It's been too long. How are you? How's Ella?" "We're managing," he said. "But Rebecca, I need your help with something complicated." As he explained Miriam's situation, he could hear Rebecca taking notes, asking sharp questions about timeline, documentation, and the specific nature of the abuse. Her legal mind was already working through the implications. "This is serious, Caleb," she said when he finished. "If she has no legal documentation, she's vulnerable in ways most people can't imagine. But it's not insurmountable. We can file for recognition of her birth records, apply for Social Security documentation, establish her legal independence. The bigger question is whether she's ready for the scrutiny that comes with legal protection." "What do you mean?" "I mean that if we go the official route, her story becomes public record. The abuse allegations, the circumstances of her leaving the community, all of it could end up in court documents that anyone can access. For someone from a closed community like the Amish, that kind of exposure can feel like a second trauma." Caleb looked toward the guest room where Miriam was presumably sleeping, though he suspected she was actually lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with fears she couldn't yet articulate. "She's stronger than she thinks," he said, "but she's also terrified of bringing shame on her family, even though they failed to protect her." "Victims often feel that way," Rebecca said gently. "The important thing is that any decision has to be hers. We can't save her from one situation where she had no choice by putting her in another one where she has no choice." "I know," Caleb said, "but Rebecca, if her community comes for her before she's ready to make that choice—" "Then we'll deal with it," Rebecca interrupted. "Send me everything you know about her situation. I'll start researching precedents and preparing options. And Caleb, you did the right thing, bringing her home. Whatever else happens, she's alive and safe because you were willing to get involved." After hanging up, Caleb sat at his kitchen table, looking around at the space that had become so much more than just his and Ella's refuge. Miriam's presence had changed the dynamics of their small family, adding layers of complexity, but also unexpected gifts. Ella was happier, more engaged, learning about different ways of life and thinking. Mrs. Kowalski had found new purpose in teaching traditional skills to someone who truly appreciated them. And Caleb himself was discovering that his capacity for caring hadn't died with Sarah. The protective love he felt for Miriam was different from what he'd shared with his wifeless romantic, than practical, less passionate than determined, but it was real and growing stronger each day. The question was whether that would be enough to navigate the challenges ahead, when the outside world inevitably intruded on the fragile sanctuary they'd created together. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered not by the postal service, but by Bishop Levi Beeler himself, a stern-faced man in his 60s who knocked on Caleb's door just after dawn. Mrs. Kowalski answered while Caleb was getting Ella ready for school, and the sound of raised voices in the hallway sent a chill of dread through the apartment. Miriam had been in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the bishop's voice speaking Pennsylvania Dutch in the commanding tone she knew all too well. The mixing bowl slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor as she backed against the counter, her face draining of all color. "Miriam Stoltzfus," Bishop Beeler called through the door. "I know you are in there. You will come home now. This foolishness has gone on long enough." Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway, taking in Miriam's terrified state and the broken ceramics scattered across the floor. Without hesitation, he stepped between her and the door, his jaw set with the kind of quiet determination that had gotten him through 2 years of medical crises with Ella. "It's okay," he said quietly to Miriam. "You don't have to go anywhere." He opened the door to find Bishop Beeler standing rigid in the hallway, his dark coat and hat making him look like a figure from another century. Mrs. Kowalski hovered behind him, clearly unhappy about having been forced to wake the household. "Mr. Jensen," the bishop said in heavily accented but clear English, "I am Bishop Beeler. You have something that belongs to our community." "I have a young woman who asked for help," Caleb replied evenly. "And as far as I know, people don't belong to communities. They choose to be part of them." The bishop's expression hardened. "Miriam Stoltzfus is betrothed to a respected elder of our church. She has brought shame upon her family and dishonor upon our community by running away from her responsibilities. She will return with me now." "She's an adult," Caleb said, his voice remaining calm despite the anger building in his chest. "She can make her own decisions." "She is a child who has been led astray by English influences," Bishop Beeler replied coldly. "She has forgotten her place and her duties to God and family." From behind, Caleb came a small voice, trembling but determined. "I have not forgotten God, Bishop Beeler. But I have learned that God does not want his daughters to be beaten and violated by men who claim to speak for him." Miriam had appeared in the doorway, her hands still shaking but her chin raised with newfound courage. The sight of her seemed to infuriate the bishop, whose face flushed red beneath his grey beard. "You speak lies and blasphemy," he thundered. "Elder Yoda is a righteous man, chosen by God to lead our community. Your accusations are the words of a fallen woman seeking to justify her sinful behavior." "Then why am I covered in scars he gave me?" Miriam asked, touching the partially healed cut on her cheek. "Why did he tell me that if I screamed when he hurt me, God would punish my family for my disobedience?" The bishop's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Satan gives smooth words to those who serve him. You have been corrupted by the English world, and now you seek to corrupt others with your lies." Caleb stepped forward, his protective instincts overriding his attempt at diplomacy. "I think you need to leave, now." "I will not leave without what belongs to our community," Bishop Beeler said firmly. "Miriam will return to fulfill her obligations, or she will be excommunicated and shunned. Her family will treat her as dead. Her name will be removed from our records. She will have no place in this world or the next." The threat hit Miriam like a physical blow, and Caleb could see her resolve wavering. The Amish concept of shunning was more than just social isolation, it was spiritual death, the cutting of all ties that had defined her identity since birth. "Miriam," Caleb said gently, "you don't have to decide anything right now." But Bishop Beeler pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and held it out to her. "Your parents have written you a letter. They beg you to come home before it is too late, before your soul is lost forever." With trembling hands, Miriam took the letter. The handwriting on the envelope was her mother's careful, precise Pennsylvania Dutch script that brought tears to her eyes before she even opened it. "Read it," the bishop commanded. "See how your selfishness has destroyed your family's peace." Caleb watched Miriam's face as she read, saw the tears begin to fall as her mother's words worked their intended effect. He couldn't read Pennsylvania Dutch, but he could read the emotional devastation the letter was causing. "What does it say?" he asked softly. Miriam's voice was barely a whisper. "She says they are ashamed, that the whole community knows their daughter has become a whore and a liar. That my father cannot show his face at church because of what I have done. That if I truly love them, I will come home and make this right by marrying Elder Yoda and asking forgiveness for my lies." The manipulation was so calculated, so cruel, that Caleb felt his anger boil over. "Your parents wrote that, about their own daughter." "They believe it," Miriam said, her voice breaking. "They have to believe it, because if they don't, it means they failed to protect me. It means their community, their whole way of life, is built on lies." Bishop Byler seized on her emotional vulnerability. "Come home, Miriam. Repent of your sins. Accept God's will for your life. Your family waits for you with open arms." For a moment, Caleb thought she might actually go. The pull of family, of belonging, of everything she had ever known, was written clearly on her face. But then Ella appeared beside him, her small hand slipping into Miriam's. "You don't have to go back to people who hurt you," Ella said with 6-year-old wisdom. "Sometimes families are the people who choose to love you, not just the people you're born to." The simple truth from a child seemed to break through Miriam's anguish. She looked down at Ella, then at Caleb, then back at the bishop who represented everything she was supposed to be but could no longer accept. "I cannot go back," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I cannot marry a man who hurts women. I cannot pretend that God wants me to be silent about evil. I cannot let other girls suffer what I have suffered just to keep my family comfortable with their beliefs." Bishop Byler's face twisted with fury. "Then you are dead to us, dead to your family, dead to your community, dead to God himself. You will live as an outcast, and you will die alone and unmourned." "She won't be alone," Caleb said firmly. "She has people who care about her, people who will protect her. English people who will use her and discard her when they tire of playing savior," the bishop spat. "You think you are helping her, but you are destroying what remains of her soul." The accusation stung because part of Caleb wondered if there was truth to it. Was he really helping Miriam, or was he simply collecting broken people to fix his own sense of purposelessness? Was his protection genuine, or was it another form of control? But as he looked at Miriam scarred, terrified, but standing her ground against everything that had once defined her, he knew that whatever his motivations, her safety and healing were more important than his own doubts. "I think our conversation is over," he said to the bishop. "Miriam has made her choice." Bishop Byler's eyes burned with righteous fury, but after a long moment he turned and walked away without another word. The silence he left behind was heavy with the weight of bridges burned and relationships severed forever. Later that morning, after Ella had gone to school and Mrs. Kowalski had swept up the broken bowl, Caleb found Miriam sitting at the kitchen table with her mother's letter spread before her. She had read it multiple times, and each reading seemed to carve deeper lines of pain into her face. "I've lost them," she said quietly. "My parents, my siblings, everyone I've ever known. I'm truly alone now." Caleb sat across from her, choosing his words carefully. "You're not alone. But Miriam, I need you to understand something. What just happened, that's only the beginning. Bishop Byler isn't going to give up. He's going to try other ways to force you back." "What do you mean?" "I mean, he might involve the civil authorities. He might claim you're mentally incompetent or that I'm holding you against your will. He might find ways to make our lives very difficult until you decide it's easier to go back than to keep fighting." Miriam's face paled. "I won't go back. I can't." "Then we need to make sure you don't have to," Caleb said, "which means we need legal protection, real protection, not just my good intentions." Rebecca Martinez arrived that afternoon, bringing with her a briefcase full of legal documents and a mind sharp enough to cut through the complex issues surrounding Miriam's status. She was a small woman with fierce dark eyes and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from years of fighting institutional power on behalf of the powerless. "Miriam," she said after reviewing the situation, "what happened to you this morning is called coercive control. It's a form of abuse that uses shame, isolation, and threats to force compliance. The fact that it's wrapped in religious language doesn't make it any less toxic." "But they are my family," Miriam protested. "My community. Without them, what am I?" "You're a 19-year-old woman who has survived trauma and found the courage to seek safety," Rebecca replied firmly. "You're someone who has taken the first steps toward building a life free from violence and control. That takes incredible strength." She spread several documents across the kitchen table. "Here's what we can do. First, we establish your legal identity birth certificate, social security number, the works. Second, we file a restraining order against Elder Yoda to prevent him from contacting or approaching you. Third, we document the abuse you've suffered in case criminal charges become necessary." Miriam stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. "Criminal charges? Sexual assault, battery, coercion? What he did to you wasn't just morally wrong. It was illegal under Iowa law. The fact that your community chose to ignore it doesn't change that. But if I press charges, it will destroy my family. The shame will follow them forever." Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "Miriam, you didn't create this situation. You didn't choose to be abused. The shame belongs to the people who hurt you and the people who protected your abuser. You are not responsible for the consequences of other people's choices." The legal consultation lasted several hours, with Rebecca patiently explaining options and implications while Miriam wrestled with decisions that would shape the rest of her life. By the time they finished, the paperwork was filed to begin establishing Miriam's legal identity, but the larger questions remained unanswered. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Caleb, Ella, Miriam, and Mrs. Kowalski's atmosphere was subdued. The morning's confrontation had shattered any illusion that Miriam's presence could remain a private matter indefinitely. Rebecca mentioned another option, Caleb said carefully, breaking the silence. "Something that would give you immediate legal protection without having to wait for all the paperwork to be processed." Miriam looked up from her untouched plate. "What kind of option?" Caleb felt his heart racing as he prepared to voice the idea that had been forming in his mind all day. "Marriage. If we got married, you'd have legal standing as my wife. Immigration status, medical coverage, protection from anyone trying to claim you're incompetent or need to be returned to your community." The suggestion hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Mrs. Kowalski stopped chewing. Ella looked back and forth between them with wide eyes. Miriam stared at Caleb, as if he'd spoken in tongues. "Marriage," she repeated slowly. "Not a real marriage," Caleb clarified quickly. "I mean, it would be legally real, but it would be for protection, not we wouldn't." He found himself stumbling over words he'd never thought he'd need to say. "It would be a practical arrangement, temporary if you wanted, just until you're established and safe." Miriam was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal with the same careful attention she gave everything else. "You would do that? Marry a stranger to protect her?" "You're not a stranger," Caleb said simply. "Not anymore. You're family." The truth of those words surprised him, even as he spoke them. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, Miriam had become more than just a house guest or a charity case. She had become integral to their daily life, a presence that had enriched their small family in ways he was only beginning to understand. "I need to think," Miriam said finally. "Of course," Caleb replied. "Take all the time you need." But as he watched her retreat to her room, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was a luxury they might not have. Bishop Byler's visit had been a warning shot, and Caleb suspected the real battle was still to come. 3 days later, Miriam found Caleb sitting on the small balcony outside the apartment, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint the Iowa sky in shades of gold and pink. The early morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed from one of the remaining farms that hadn't yet been swallowed by suburban development. "I've made my decision," she said quietly, settling into the chair beside him. Caleb set down his coffee cup, his heart suddenly racing despite his attempt to remain calm. "Whatever you've decided, it's the right choice. There's no wrong answer here." Miriam smiled at his attempt to be supportive without being pressuring. "You are a good man, Caleb Jensen. Your wife was lucky to have you." "I was the lucky one," he replied, the automatic response he'd given countless times since Sarah's death. "Yes," Miriam said simply. "You were both lucky. Real love is rare. I have never seen it except in books and dreams." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Mrs. Kowalski emerge from her apartment below to water her flower boxes. The elderly woman waved up at them, her weathered face creased in a knowing smile that suggested she understood more about their situation than she let on. "I will marry you," Miriam said suddenly, the words coming out in a rush, as if she'd been holding her breath. "Not for love, as you said, for protection, for safety. For the chance to build a life where I can choose my own path." Caleb felt a mixture of relief and unexpected nervousness. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. Your community will consider it the final betrayal. Even if we divorce later, you could never return to the Amish world." "I know," Miriam said with quiet certainty. "I've been thinking about what Ella said, that families are the people who choose to love you. I want to choose my family, instead of being trapped by the one I was born into." "Miriam," Caleb said carefully, "I need you to understand what this means. Legally, you'll be my wife. You'll have rights and responsibilities. But I also need you to know that I won't. This doesn't give me any claims on you personally. Your body, your choices, your future, they're all still yours." She looked at him with something that might have been gratitude mixed with surprise. "You would promise that? Even though I would be your wife?" "Especially because you'd be my wife," Caleb said firmly. "Marriage should be about protection and partnership, not ownership. Sarah taught me that." The simplicity of the courthouse ceremony, 3 days later, stood in stark contrast to the complexity of emotions surrounding it. Judge Patricia Hawkins, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had seen her share of unusual circumstances, asked the standard questions with professional detachment, while Rebecca Martinez served as a witness alongside Mrs. Kowalski and Ella. Miriam wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Kowalski had helped her select, her hair covered by a small white cap that represented a compromise between her traditional modesty and the expectations of the modern world. Caleb had chosen his best shirt and tie, the same ones he'd worn to Sarah's funeral, though he tried not to think about the symbolism. "Do you, Caleb Thomas Jensen, take Miriam Elizabeth Stoltzfus to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the surreal nature of marrying someone he'd known for less than a month. "Do you, Miriam Elizabeth Stoltzfus, take Caleb Thomas Jensen to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Miriam's voice was barely above a whisper, but it was clear. "I do. By the power vested in me by the state of Iowa, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The moment of awkwardness that followed was mercifully brief. Caleb leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to Miriam's cheek, while she closed her eyes and tried not to flinch at the unexpected contact. It was the first time a man had touched her gently since her father had stopped hugging her on her 16th birthday, declaring her too old for such displays of affection. "Congratulations, Mrs. Jensen," Judge Hawkins said with a warm smile. "I hope you'll be very happy together." Mrs. Jensen. The name felt foreign on Miriam's tongue when she repeated it to herself. Miriam Jensen. A new identity to go with her new life, a legal shield against the forces that had tried to control and define her since birth. The celebration afterward was modest but meaningful. Mrs. Kowalski had prepared a Polish dinner with all of Caleb's favorites, while Ella had made decorations from construction paper and glitter that proclaimed, "Welcome to the family," in 6-year-old handwriting. Rebecca stayed for dinner, briefing them on the legal protections the marriage provided and the steps they still needed to take to establish Miriam's independent identity. "This buys you time," she explained over Mrs. Kowalski's pierogi. "Time to get your social security card, your driver's license, your own bank account. Time to figure out what you want to do with your life without anyone pressuring you to make decisions based on fear." Miriam nodded, though the concept of making decisions based on her own desires rather than external expectations was still foreign to her. "What if I don't know what I want?" "Then you have time to figure that out too," Rebecca replied. "That's what freedom means, the right to discover who you are when no one else is telling you who you should be." Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared and Ella had been tucked into bed, Caleb and Miriam found themselves alone in the living room for the first time as husband and wife. The awkwardness was palpable, two virtual strangers who had just committed to a legal bond that felt both intensely personal and strangely businesslike. "I should probably explain how this is going to work," Caleb said, settling into his usual chair while Miriam perched nervously on the edge of the couch. "Nothing has to change in terms of our daily routine. You keep your room, your privacy, your independence. We're married on paper, but we're still just friends, housemates. Whatever feels comfortable." Miriam twisted the simple gold band on her finger, a ring they'd purchased at a jewelry store that morning, chosen more for practicality than sentiment. "What about people's expectations? Neighbors, your friends, Ella's teachers?" "We'll figure it out as we go," Caleb said. "The important thing is that you feel safe and supported. Everything else is just details." But as the days passed, those details proved more complex than either of them had anticipated. Word of the marriage spread quickly through their small community, generating reactions that ranged from supportive to scandalized. Some people praised Caleb for his compassion in helping a young woman in crisis. Others whispered about the impropriety of a widowed man taking up with an Amish girl less than half his age. The most challenging reactions came from those closest to them. Dr. Martinez expressed concern about the speed of the marriage and its potential impact on Ella's stability. Caleb's dispatcher at the trucking company made uncomfortable jokes about robbing the cradle and getting yourself a young wife. Even some of the other drivers, men Caleb had considered friends, seemed to view his marriage as either predatory or pathetically desperate. "People talk," Mrs. Kowalski observed one afternoon as she helped Miriam learn to use the washing machine. "Is natural. They see quick marriage, they think romance or scandal. They don't understand sometimes marriage is about survival." Miriam appreciated the older woman's pragmatic perspective, but she was struggling with her own feelings about the arrangement. The legal protection was exactly what she'd needed, and Caleb had been nothing but respectful and kind. But the constant explanations, the suspicious looks, the assumptions about their relationship were wearing her down. More challenging still was her growing awareness that her feelings toward Caleb were becoming more complicated than gratitude and friendship. She found herself looking forward to their morning conversations over coffee, appreciating his quiet strength and the way he interacted with Ella. She noticed how his eyes crinkled when he smiled, how he unconsciously hummed while doing dishes, how he always made sure she felt included in family decisions. The realization that she might be developing romantic feelings for her husband of convenience was both thrilling and terrifying. She had no experience with genuine affection between men and women, no template for healthy relationships built on mutual respect rather than power and control. The idea that someone might actually care about her happiness rather than her compliance was revolutionary. But she was also acutely aware of the imbalance in their arrangement. Caleb had married her out of compassion and protective instinct, not attraction or love. He was still grieving his first wife, still wearing his wedding ring from his real marriage. Miriam was a responsibility he'd taken on, not a partner he'd chosen. The confusion came to a head one evening when Ella had another seizure, more severe than usual. Miriam found herself working alongside Caleb to manage the emergency, timing the episode and helping to keep Ella safe while they waited for it to pass. In the aftermath, as they sat on either side of Ella's bed watching her sleep, Caleb reached over and squeezed Miriam's hand in gratitude. The simple gesture warm, appreciative, completely innocent, sent a shock of awareness through her system. This was what partnership felt like. This was what it meant to work together toward a common goal, to support each other through crisis, to share the responsibility of caring for someone they both loved. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without you here." "You would have managed," Miriam replied, though she made no move to pull her hand away. "You always do." "Maybe, but it's better not to manage alone." The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to address. They were still holding hands when Mrs. Kowalski appeared in the doorway, took in the intimate scene, and smiled knowingly before retreating without comment. Later, lying in her bed in the small guest room, Miriam stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of her conflicted emotions. She was legally married to a good man who treated her with respect and kindness. She was safe, protected, and beginning to heal from years of trauma. She had a home, a family, a future that wasn't defined by violence and control. But she was also living a leap pretending to be satisfied with a marriage of convenience when she was beginning to want something real. The question was whether she had the courage to risk their careful arrangement by admitting that her feelings had evolved beyond gratitude and friendship. In the morning, she thought she might find the words. In the morning, she might be brave enough to tell Caleb that the marriage she'd entered for protection had become something she wanted to keep for love. But first, she had to survive the night and the growing certainty that her heart was leading her into territory that was both more dangerous and more hopeful than anything she'd ever known. The revelation came in the form of a terrified 17-year-old girl named Rachel Lapp, who appeared at their door on a rainy Thursday evening 3 weeks after the wedding. She was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably, and clutching a canvas bag that seemed to contain everything she owned in the world. "Please," she whispered when Caleb opened the door. "I'm looking for Miriam Stoltzfus, Miriam Jensen. They say she lives here now." Miriam appeared behind Caleb, taking one look at the frightened girl and immediately ushering her inside. "Rachel? Mein Gott, what are you doing here? How did you find me?" "The English doctor, Dr. Chench, told me where to find you," Rachel said, her teeth chattering from cold and fear. "She said you might help me because you understand." "Doctor?" Sarah Chen was the Mennonite nurse Rebecca had mentioned, someone who worked with both the Amish and English communities and understood the complex cultural dynamics that could leave vulnerable people trapped between two worlds. The fact that she had sent Rachel here suggested the situation was serious. "Help you with what?" Miriam asked gently, guiding Rachel to the kitchen table while Mrs. Kowalski bustled around making tea and finding dry clothes. Rachel's story emerged slowly, between sips of hot tea and fits of crying that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. She was from a different Amish community than Miriam, about 30 miles away, but the pattern was sickeningly familiar. Elder Samuel Yoda had recently taken a position of leadership in their district, bringing with him his reputation for spiritual guidance and community service. "He said I had the calling to serve," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "That God had chosen me to help with his household, to learn proper wifely duties before my own marriage. My parents were honored that such a respected man would take interest in my spiritual development." Caleb felt his jaw clench as he realized where this was heading. Beside him, Miriam had gone pale, her hands gripping her teacup so tightly her knuckles were white. "What did he do to you?" Miriam asked, though they all already knew the answer. "At first it was just cleaning and cooking," Rachel continued. "But then he started saying I needed to learn about submission, about obedience. He said wives must be prepared to submit to their husbands in all things, and that practicing submission was part of my spiritual education." The room fell silent except for the rain against the windows and Ella's quiet breathing from the living room where she was doing homework. Mrs. Kowalski crossed herself and muttered something in Polish that sounded like a prayer or a curse. When I tried to tell my parents, they said I was misunderstanding Elder Yoda's spiritual guidance. Rachel went on. They said I was letting the devil put sinful thoughts in my head, that I should be grateful for the attention of such a holy man. So you ran away, Caleb said, understanding the desperate courage it had taken for a 17-year-old Amish girl to flee everything she'd ever known. Rachel shook her head. Not at first. I tried to be a good daughter, a good community member. I tried to believe that it was my fault, that I was somehow tempting a righteous man into sin. She looked up at Miriam with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. But then I found the photographs. Miriam's teacup slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. Photographs? With trembling hands, Rachel opened her canvas bag and pulled out a manila envelope. I was cleaning his study last week when I knocked over a box. These fell out. She spread the contents across the kitchen table, and Caleb felt his stomach lurch. There were dozens of photographs, Polaroid snapshots, that showed young Amish women in various states of undress and distress. Some of the faces were familiar to Miriam, girls from her own community or neighboring districts. Others were strangers, but the fear in their eyes was universal. There are more, Rachel whispered. Letters, documents. He keeps records of what he does, like it's some kind of collection. Miriam was staring at one particular photograph, her face completely drained of color. It showed a young woman Caleb didn't recognize, but the resemblance to Miriam was unmistakable. The same delicate features, the same traditional dress, the same expression of terrified submission. That's my cousin Sarah, Miriam said, her voice hollow. She died 2 years ago. They said it was pneumonia, but she picked up the photograph with shaking hands. She was engaged to Elder Yoda's son. She lived in his household for 6 months before the wedding. She didn't die of pneumonia, Rachel said quietly. There's a letter in his collection. She wrote it before she took her own life. She couldn't live with what he'd done to her, and she couldn't bear the thought of marrying into that family. The implications hit Caleb like a physical blow. This wasn't just about one man's abuse of vulnerable women. This was systematic predation spanning years, possibly decades, with victims who had been silenced by shame, community pressure, and a culture that protected the reputation of powerful men over the safety of powerless women. How many, he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. The photographs go back 15 years. I counted at least 30 different girls. Some of them are married now, with children. Some moved away to other communities, and some... She couldn't finish the sentence. Miriam stood abruptly, walking to the window and staring out at the rain-soaked parking lot. We have to stop him, she said finally. We can't let this continue. How? Rachel asked desperately. Who would believe us? He's an elder, a pillar of the community. We're survivors, Miriam interrupted, turning back to face them. And now we have proof. Caleb studied the evidence spread across his kitchen table, his mind racing through the implications. This is enough to put him away for life, he said. Sexual assault, exploitation of minors, coercion. The FBI would be very interested in this. But using it means destroying our communities, Miriam said, voicing the concern that was weighing on all of them. It means exposing the shame and pain of dozens of women who never asked to be public victims. It means admitting that our elders, our spiritual leaders, our whole way of life has been corrupted. It also means stopping him from hurting anyone else, Caleb pointed out gently. And it means giving justice to the women he's already hurt, including Sarah. The kitchen fell silent as they all contemplated the magnitude of the decision before them. Rachel pulled another document from her Baga letter written in the careful script that Miriam recognized as her cousin's handwriting. Sarah wrote this the night before she died, Rachel said, unfolding the aged paper. She hid it in Elder Yoda's own study, probably hoping someone would find it someday. Miriam took the letter with trembling hands and began to read aloud, her voice breaking with each word. If anyone finds this, please know that I am not weak or sinful as they will say. Elder Yoda has done terrible things to me and to other girls, things that no man of God would ever do. He told me that if I spoke the truth, my family would be shunned and I would be responsible for destroying our community. But I cannot marry his son knowing what his father is. I cannot bring children into a family built on lies and suffering. I cannot live knowing that my silence allows him to hurt other girls the way he hurt me. I am sorry for the pain my death will cause, but I pray that someday someone will have the courage to speak the truth I could not bear to voice while living. There are others. Please find them. Please help them. Please stop him before he destroys more innocent girls who trusted him to be a man of God. The letter ended with Sarah's signature and a date from 2 years ago. Below her name, she had written a list of other girls' names, girls she knew or suspected had been victimized by Elder Yoda. Miriam's name was at the top of the list. Mrs. Kowalski had tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. That poor child, she whispered, to be so alone, so desperate, with no one to turn to. She wasn't alone, Miriam said fiercely. She had us, she has us, and we're going to make sure her death wasn't meaningless. Rachel looked between them with a mixture of hope and terror. What are you saying? I'm saying we're going to do what Sarah couldn't, Miriam replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. We're going to tell the truth, all of it, and we're going to make sure Elder Samuel Yoda never hurts another girl again. Caleb felt a surge of protective pride watching his wife, because that's what she was now, in every way that mattered, transformed from victim to advocate before his eyes. Rebecca needs to see this, he said. Tonight, this changes everything. The other girls on Sarah's list, Rachel said hesitantly. Some of them are married now, have families. Coming forward would destroy their lives. Their lives are already destroyed, Miriam said with quiet conviction. They're just pretending they're not. I know because I was pretending too. But pretending doesn't heal the wounds, and it doesn't protect the next victim. She gathered the photographs and documents with steady hands, her decision made. We're going to give them a choice. We're going to find every woman on this list and tell them they're not alone, that they have people who believe them, who will support them if they want to speak up. And if they choose to stay silent, we'll respect that choice. But we won't let their silence stop us from protecting the girls who haven't been hurt yet. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the small kitchen, something had shifted. 3 women who had been isolated by shame and fear had found each other and discovered that together they were stronger than the forces that had tried to silence them. Caleb looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw not the frightened girl he'd found on a dark road, but a woman of remarkable courage and integrity who was about to change the world for every vulnerable girl in every closed community that valued reputation over safety. The evidence spread across their kitchen table represented years of systematic abuse, but it also represented hope. Hope that the truth could overcome lies, that justice could triumph over power, that broken people could heal each other and create something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. Tomorrow, they would begin the long, difficult process of seeking justice. Tonight, they would plan and prepare and draw strength from their unlikely family. But first, Caleb would call Rebecca Martinez and tell her that they had just acquired the most important legal case of her career. The next 2 weeks blurred together in a whirlwind of legal preparation, emotional counseling, and the delicate work of reaching out to the women on Sarah's list. Rebecca Martinez had taken one look at the evidence and immediately involved the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit, while Dr. Chen served as a cultural liaison to help the investigators understand the complex dynamics of Amish communities. Miriam had insisted on personally contacting each woman named in Sarah's letter, a process that proved both heartbreaking and inspiring. Some refused to speak with her, hanging up the phone or closing doors in her face when they realized why she'd come. Others broke down sobbing, sharing stories of abuse that had haunted them for years, grateful to finally have someone who believed them. Mary Hirschberger, now 25 and married with 3 children, had been 14 when Elder Yoda first approached her family about spiritual guidance. "I thought I was the only one," she whispered during their meeting at Dr. Chen's clinic. For 11 years, I thought I was the only one I thought it was my fault somehow. Elizabeth King, 19, and living in a distant Amish settlement in Pennsylvania, had fled her home community after refusing Elder Yoda's instruction and being branded as rebellious and sinful. My own parents chose to believe him over me, she said through tears. But I'd rather be shunned than silent anymore. Each conversation was a piece of Miriam's heart breaking and healing simultaneously. She saw her own pain reflected in these women's faces, but she also saw their strength, their resilience, their desperate desire for justice. By the end of the 2 weeks, 8 women had agreed to testify, while several others provided written statements they were willing to have read in court. The preparation sessions with Rebecca were intense and emotionally draining. Miriam had to relive every detail of her abuse, describing incidents she'd tried to forget, answering questions that felt invasive but were necessary to build a solid case. The defense will try to paint you as vindictive, Rebecca warned during one session. They'll say you're a scorned woman seeking revenge, that you seduced Elder Yoda and are now lying to cover your shame. I know, Miriam said quietly. I'm ready for that. Are you? Rebecca asked gently. Because it's going to be brutal. They're going to question everything, your motives, your character, your mental state. They're going to suggest that your marriage to Caleb proves you're promiscuous and untrustworthy. Caleb, who had been sitting quietly through most of these sessions, finally spoke up. Then they'll have to deal with me too. Anyone who wants to attack Miriam's character is going to have to explain why a supposedly promiscuous woman inspired a widower to marry her for protection rather than exploitation. The fierce protectiveness in his voice surprised them all, including Caleb himself. Somewhere in the process of preparing for trial, his feelings for Miriam had evolved from compassionate duty to something much deeper and more personal. He found himself lying awake at night, worrying about the toll the proceedings would take on her, planning ways to shield her from the worst of the media attention, imagining scenarios where he could somehow absorb her pain and carry it himself. Miriam had noticed the change too. The careful distance they'd maintained since their marriage had gradually dissolved into a partnership that felt increasingly natural and right. They worked together to prepare meals, coordinate Ella's care, and manage the constant stream of lawyers, investigators, and counselors. Their conversations had deepened beyond practical matters to include hopes, fears, and dreams they'd never shared with anyone else. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the sunset paint the Iowa sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Miriam finally voiced the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "What happens after the trial?" she asked quietly. Caleb considered the question carefully. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what happens to us, to this?" She gestured between them, encompassing their unusual marriage and everything it represented. "When Elder Yoda is convicted and the legal protection isn't necessary anymore, what reason do we have to stay married?" The question hit Caleb like a physical blow, forcing him to confront feelings he'd been trying to ignore. The thought of Miriam leaving, of returning to their apartment without her quiet presence and gentle wisdom, was unbearable in ways he hadn't expected. "Is that what you want?" he asked carefully. "To end this when the trial is over?" Miriam was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle lazily over the distant cornfields. "I don't know what I want," she said finally. "I've never been allowed to want things for myself. I don't even know how to figure out what would make me happy." "Then maybe that's your answer," Caleb said softly. "Maybe you take time to figure that out, and we see where it leads. And if what I figure out doesn't include staying married to a man who took me in out of pity." The word pity hung between them like a challenge. Caleb turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Is that what you think this is? Pity?" "Isn't it?" Miriam asked, her voice smaller than usual. "You saw a broken girl on the side of the road, and your good heart couldn't walk away. But I'm not that girl anymore, Caleb. I'm stronger now, more independent. I don't need protecting the way I did when you found me." "No," Caleb agreed. "You don't. You've become an incredible woman, Miriam. Strong, brave, compassionate, everything I could have hoped for in a partner." which is why what I feel for you now has nothing to do with pity and everything to do with—" He stopped, realizing he was about to cross a line they'd carefully maintained for months. "Everything to do with what?" Miriam prompted, her heart racing. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the frightened refugee he'd rescued, but the remarkable woman she'd become. "Everything to do with love," he said simply. "Not the desperate, protective love I felt for Sarah, but something different, something that's about admiration and partnership and wanting to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life." The admission hung between them in the evening air, heavy with possibility and risk. Miriam felt tears start in her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of hearing someone speak the words she'd been afraid to hope for. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been so scared to admit it because I didn't want to ruin what we have. But I love you, Caleb. Not as the man who saved me, but as the man who sees me as I really am and thinks I'm worth loving." The kiss that followed was gentle and tentative, nothing like the violent possession Miriam had learned to associate with physical contact between men and women. This was soft, respectful, full of promises rather than demands. When they broke apart, both were crying. "After the trial," Caleb said, resting his forehead against hers, "I'd like to take you on a real honeymoon. Somewhere beautiful and peaceful where we can start over as husband and wife instead of protector and refugee." "I'd like that," Miriam said, smiling through her tears. "I'd like that very much." The moment was interrupted by Ella's voice calling from inside. "Daddy! Miriam! There's a man at the door with a camera." They rushed inside to find Mrs. Kowalski blocking the entrance, while a reporter from the Des Moines Register tried to push his way past her with questions about the Amish abuse scandal and demands for an exclusive interview with the wife who exposed it. "All." "No comment," Caleb said firmly, gently moving Mrs. Kowalski aside and facing the reporter. "My wife and I have nothing to say to the media." "Mr. Jensen, surely you understand the public interest in this case?" The reporter pressed. "A respected religious leader accused of systematic abuse, young Amish women coming forward with decades of allegations." "What I understand," Caleb interrupted, "is that my wife is a victim of serious crimes who deserves privacy and respect while she seeks justice. Now, please leave our property." After the reporter left, Rebecca called to warn them that media attention was likely to intensify as the trial date approached. "Elder Yoda's attorney is already trying to spin this as an attack on religious freedom," she said. "They're portraying him as a victim of modern persecution and suggesting that the accusers are lying to get money or attention." "Money?" Miriam asked, bewildered. "What money? We're not seeking financial compensation." "I know," Rebecca said, "but facts don't matter in the court of public opinion. We need to be prepared for a media circus that could get very ugly." The prediction proved accurate. Over the next few days, reporters camped outside their apartment building, following Caleb to work and trying to intercept Ella on her way to school. The story had caught national attention, with cable news shows featuring debates about religious freedom versus victims' rights, and social media buzzing with opinions from people who had never heard of Elder Yoda before the scandal broke. Some of the coverage was supportive, praising Miriam's courage and highlighting the broader issue of abuse in closed religious communities. But much of it was hostile, portraying her as a disgruntled woman seeking to destroy an innocent man's reputation, or worse, as someone who had tempted a holy man into sin. The stress began to show on all of them. Ella had nightmares about strangers trying to take pictures of her. Mrs. Kowalski developed a persistent cough from the anxiety. Caleb found himself snapping at co-workers and losing sleep, worrying about his family's safety. But the worst impact was on Miriam herself. The constant scrutiny, the hostile comments, the suggestions that she was lying or mentally unstable began to erode her carefully rebuilt confidence. She started second-guessing her decision to come forward, wondering if the cost to everyone she loved was worth the potential benefit to future victims. "Maybe I should withdraw my testimony," she said one evening after a particularly brutal day of media coverage. "The other women could still testify. They don't need me to make their case." They need you more than you realize, Dr. Chen said firmly during an emergency counseling session. You're the one who brought them together, who gave them courage to speak up. If you back down now, some of them will too, and Elder Yoda might escape justice entirely. But look what it's doing to my family, Miriam protested, gesturing toward Ella, who was huddled in Caleb's lap, exhausted from another day of hiding from cameras. Your family is strong enough to handle this, Caleb said quietly. We knew it would be hard, but we also knew it was right, and sometimes doing the right thing is hard. The final straw came when someone threw a rock through their apartment window, accompanied by a note that called Miriam a whore and threatened to finish what Elder Yoda started. Sheriff Morrison increased patrols around their building, but the message was clear. There were people who would rather see Miriam silenced permanently than allow her to testify. That night, as they cleaned up broken glass and tried to comfort a terrified Ella, Miriam made her final decision. I'm testifying, she said with quiet determination. Whatever happens, however hard they try to break me, I'm going to stand up in that courtroom and tell the truth. For Sarah, for the other women, for every girl who might be hurt if we don't stop him. Are you sure? Caleb asked, holding her close while Ella finally fell asleep between them. I'm sure, Miriam said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. I'm not the frightened girl you found on that road anymore. I'm a woman with people who love me, with a family worth fighting for, with a story that needs to be told. And tomorrow, the whole world is going to hear it. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity when Miriam arrived on the morning of her testimony. Media crews lined the steps. Protesters held signs both supporting and condemning her, and a heavy police presence struggled to maintain order. Caleb walked beside her, his hands steady on her back as they navigated through the crowd, ignoring the shouted questions and camera flashes. Inside, the formal courtroom felt both imposing and intimate. Elder Samuel Yoda sat at the defendant's table, his dark suit and beard, making him look every inch the respected religious leader he'd once been. He didn't look at Miriam as she entered, but she could feel his presence like a weight on her chest, triggering memories she'd worked hard to overcome. The prosecution table was organized and professional, with Rebecca Martinez and federal prosecutor James Walsh reviewing their notes one final time. Behind them, in the gallery, sat the other women who would testify, Mary, Elizabeth, and 6 others who had found the courage to speak their truth publicly. Dr. Chen was there too, along with Mrs. Kowalski and several other supporters who had become part of Miriam's extended family. Judge Catherine Morisono, relation to Sheriff Morrison, called the court to order with the gravitas befitting such a serious case. She was a woman in her 60s, known for her fairness but also for her intolerance of legal theatrics or attempts to manipulate the proceedings. The state calls Miriam Jensen to the stand, Prosecutor Walsh announced. Miriam stood on unsteady legs, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom following her movement. The walk to the witness stand felt endless, but with each step she drew strength from the knowledge that she was not alone. Caleb's steadying presence, the supportive faces of the other survivors, the memory of Sarah's courage in writing her final letter, all of it combined to give her the resolve she needed. Please raise your right hand, the court clerk instructed. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? The irony of swearing on a Bible to testify against a man who had used religion to justify abuse was not lost on Miriam. But she placed her hand on the leather-bound book and spoke clearly, I do. Please state your name for the record. Miriam Elizabeth Jensen, formerly Miriam Stoltzfus. Mrs. Jensen, Prosecutor Walsh began, his voice gentle but authoritative. Can you tell the court how you know the defendant, Samuel Yoda? Miriam took a steadying breath and began her testimony. Elder Yoda was a respected leader in my Amish community. When I was 16, my parents arranged for me to marry him after his first wife died. The engagement lasted 3 years, during which time he said he was preparing me to be a proper wife. Can you describe what this preparation involved? For the next hour, Miriam recounted the systematic abuse she had endured, speaking in clear, measured tones about incidents that had once filled her with shame and terror. She described the escalating violence, the threats, the way Elder Yoda had used religious doctrine to justify his actions and ensure her silence. "He told me that wives must submit to their husbands in all things," she testified. "He said that what he was doing was God's will, and that if I resisted or told anyone, I would be responsible for destroying a godly man's reputation and bringing shame on my family." "How did this abuse make you feel?" Walsh asked. "Powerless," Miriam replied without hesitation. "Trapped, like I was less than human, just an object for his use. But more than that, it made me question everything I'd been taught about God and faith and what it means to be a good person." The defense attorney, a sharp-suited man named Gerald Hoffman, objected repeatedly to the characterization of religious instruction as abuse, but Judge Morrison allowed the testimony to continue. "Mrs. Jensen, can you tell the court about the night you finally decided to leave your community?" Miriam's voice wavered slightly as she described the final assault that had left her with the scars still visible on her face. "He came to my parents' house after they had gone to bed. He said he wanted to make sure I understood my wifely duties before our wedding the following month. When I tried to resist, he became violent. He struck me with his fist, and then with a piece of kindling from the fireplace." She touched the faint scar on her cheek unconsciously. "He told me that if I ever spoke of what happened, he would make sure everyone knew I was a whore who had tempted a righteous man into sin. He said no one would believe me over him and that my family would be shunned because of my lies." "What did you do after this assault?" "I waited until he left. Then I packed what I could carry and walked away from everything I had ever known. I had no money, no identification, nowhere to go. I just knew I couldn't stay and pretend that what he was doing to me was acceptable." "How did you end up with Mr. Jensen?" "He found me walking on a county road. I was wearing a burlap sack over my head because I was ashamed of the injuries Elder Yoda had given me. Mr. Jensen stopped his truck and offered to help." Miriam looked directly at Caleb for the first time since beginning her testimony. "He saved my life that night, not just from immediate danger, but from a future of continued abuse." "Mrs. Jensen, you're now married to Mr. Jensen. Some people have suggested that this marriage calls your credibility into question, that you might be lying about Elder Yoda to justify your relationship with an Englishman. How do you respond to that?" Miriam straightened in her chair, her voice growing stronger. "I married Caleb Jensen because he offered me legal protection when my own community abandoned me. But more than that, I married him because he showed me what a real man of God looks like. Someone who protects the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. Someone who uses his strength to help others instead of to hurt them." The courtroom was completely silent as Miriam continued. "Elder Yoda taught me that marriage was about ownership and control. Caleb taught me that it should be about partnership and mutual respect. The fact that I can sit here today, speaking freely about what happened to me, is proof of which approach leads to healing and which leads to destruction." Prosecutor Walsh nodded approvingly before moving to his final questions. "Mrs. Jensen, are you testifying today for money or revenge?" "No," Miriam said firmly. "I'm testifying for my cousin Sarah, who took her own life rather than marry into Elder Yoda's family. I'm testifying for Rachel Lapp and the other young women who found the courage to come forward. I'm testifying for every girl in every closed community who is being told that God wants her to accept abuse in silence. Thank you, Mrs. Jensen. No further questions." As Prosecutor Walsh returned to his seat, Miriam braced herself for cross-examination. Defense Attorney Hoffman approached the witness stand with the predatory confidence of someone who believed he could discredit her testimony and destroy her credibility. "Mrs. Jensen," he began, his tone immediately hostile. "Or should I say, Mrs. Stoltzfus? After all, your marriage to Mr. Jensen is rather convenient, isn't it?" "I'm legally married to Caleb Jensen," Miriam replied calmly. "That makes me Mrs. Jensen. A marriage that took place just weeks after you left your community. Some might say that's remarkably fast for someone who was supposedly traumatized by male contact." Rebecca started to object, but Miriam answered before the judge could rule. I married Caleb because he offered me protection and safety. The fact that our marriage has grown into something deeper doesn't change the reasons I needed that protection in the first place. Hoffman circled closer, clearly trying to intimidate her. Let's talk about those reasons, shall we? You claim Elder Yoda abused you, but isn't it true that you were actually engaged in a consensual relationship that you later regretted? No, Miriam said firmly. What Elder Yoda did to me was not consensual. It was rape, assault, and systematic abuse of power. But you never reported these alleged crimes to the authorities, did you? In my community, Elder Yoda was the authority. Reporting him would have been like... Miriam paused, searching for an analogy the jury would understand. Like reporting a crime to the criminal himself. So you took the law into your own hands by fleeing and then fabricating these accusations. I saved my own life, Miriam replied with quiet dignity. And then I found the courage to speak the truth so he couldn't hurt anyone else. Hoffman's questioning continued for another 30 minutes, each question designed to make Miriam appear unstable, vindictive, or untrustworthy. But with each attack, her responses grew more confident and clear. The frightened girl who had once cowered before Elder Yoda's authority had been replaced by a woman who understood her own worth and refused to be diminished by bullying tactics. The moment that changed everything came when defense attorney Hoffman made the tactical error of pushing too hard. Frustrated by Miriam's composed responses to his attacks, he abandoned legal strategy in favor of personal assault. Mrs. Jensen, or whatever you're calling yourself these days, isn't it true that you have a history of mental instability? That you've been treated for psychological disorders that might cause you to fabricate traumatic memories? Rebecca shot to her feet. Objection. There's no foundation for this line of questioning, and it's clearly intended to harass the witness. Sustained, Judge Morrison ruled firmly. Mr. Hoffman, you will stick to relevant questioning, or I will hold you in contempt. But Hoffman was past caring about judicial warnings. Your Honor, this witness's credibility is central to the case. If she's mentally unstable... Mr. Hoffman, Judge Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. You will approach the bench immediately. During the heated sidebar conference, Miriam sat quietly in the witness chair, drawing strength from the faces in the gallery. Caleb's steady presence, Mrs. Kowalski's encouraging nod, the supportive looks from the other survivors, all of it, reminded her that she was no longer the isolated, frightened girl who had once believed Elder Yoda's lies about her worthlessness. When the attorneys returned to their positions, Judge Morrison's expression was thunderous. The jury will disregard defense counsel's last question. Mr. Hoffman, you are officially on notice. But the damage was done, and in a way that worked against the defense. The jury had seen a respected attorney attempt to destroy a composed, articulate woman through personal attacks rather than evidence. Several jurors were now looking at Hoffman with undisguised disgust. Mrs. Jensen, Hoffman continued, his voice now more controlled, but still hostile. Let's talk about the evidence you claim to have against my client. You say there are photographs? Yes. Photographs that you stole from Elder Yoda's private property. Photographs that Rachel Lapp discovered while cleaning his house and brought to me because she recognized other victims. Photographs that could have been doctored or manipulated. Photographs that have been authenticated by FBI forensics experts, Miriam replied calmly. Hoffman's face reddened slightly, and this alleged suicide note from your cousin convenient that it surfaces just as you're making accusations, isn't it? For the first time during cross-examination, Miriam's composure cracked slightly. Sarah's death was not convenient for anyone, Mr. Hoffman. She was 19 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her until your client destroyed her will to live. Allegedly destroyed. Actually destroyed, Miriam interrupted, her voice growing stronger. I've seen the photographs he took of her. I've read the letter she wrote describing what he did. I've heard the same stories from 8 other women who had the courage to come forward. At what point does allegedly become obviously? The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Morrison gavelled for order. But the power dynamic had shifted. Miriam was no longer a victim being interrogated. She was a woman demanding justice for herself and others. "Mrs. Jensen," Hoffman tried again, "isn't it true that you've been coached by your husband and his attorney on what to say today?" "I've been prepared to tell the truth clearly and completely," Miriam replied. "If that's what you mean by coaching, then yes. And this truth involves destroying the reputation of a man who dedicated his life to serving God and his community." Miriam looked directly at Elder Yoda for the first time since entering the courtroom. He was staring at her with the same cold authority that had once made her cower in fear. But now, supported by people who truly loved her, she felt only pity for the broken man who had used religion to justify evil. "The truth," she said clearly, "involves exposing a man who used his position of religious authority to systematically abuse vulnerable women and then silence them with shame and threats. A man who drove my cousin to suicide rather than face the consequences of his actions. A man who continues to deny responsibility even as the evidence of his crime surrounds him." She turned back to address the jury directly. "I didn't want to destroy Elder Yoda's reputation. I wanted him to stop hurting innocent girls. But when someone uses their reputation to shield criminal behavior, sometimes destroying that reputation is the only way to protect future victims." Hoffman seemed to realize he was losing ground badly. "No further questions," he said abruptly, returning to his seat. "Redirect, Your Honor," Prosecutor Walsh announced, standing to approach the witness stand. "Mrs. Jensen, in your own words, why are you testifying today?" Miriam took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts for what she knew would be her final opportunity to speak directly to the jury. "I'm testifying because silence protects predators and condemns victims. For 3 years, I stayed silent because I was taught that was what good Amish girls do. But my silence didn't protect anyone except Elder Yoda." She paused, looking at each juror in turn. "When Rachel brought me those photographs, when I read Sarah's letter, I realized that my silence had helped enable the abuse of other women. That was unacceptable to me. Sometimes speaking difficult truths is the most faithful thing you can do. What do you hope will result from your testimony?" "I hope Elder Yoda will be held accountable for his crimes. I hope the other survivors will feel validated and supported. But mostly, I hope that no other young woman will ever have to choose between accepting abuse and losing everything she's ever known. Thank you, Mrs. Jensen. No further questions." As Miriam stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained unusually quiet. Her testimony had been powerful not just because of the evidence she presented, but because of the dignity and strength she had displayed under attack. Even some of Elder Yoda's supporters in the gallery looked shaken by what they had heard. The prosecution's case continued with the other survivors, each adding their piece to the mosaic of systematic abuse. Mary Hirschberger's testimony about being 14 when the abuse began brought tears to several jurors' eyes. Elizabeth King's account of being driven from her community for refusing Elder Yoda's advances demonstrated the consequences of resistance. Dr. Chen testified about the psychological patterns she had observed, explaining how religious authority could be weaponized to control and silence victims. FBI forensics expert Dr. Patricia Wells authenticated the photographs and documents, explaining how the evidence formed a pattern spanning 15 years. The most devastating moment came when Prosecutor Walsh read Sarah's suicide letter aloud to the jury. The courtroom was completely silent as the young woman's words filled the space, her desperate plea for someone to find the courage she couldn't muster, echoing off the walls. When the prosecution rested its case, Elder Yoda's defense seemed almost anticlimactic. Character witnesses testified to his community service and religious devotion, but they seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming evidence. Elder Yoda himself chose not to testify, a decision that spoke volumes to the jury. In closing arguments, defense attorney Hoffman made one last attempt to frame the case as an attack on religious freedom, suggesting that the accusers were motivated by money, revenge, or mental instability. But his arguments rang hollow after the jury had seen and heard the evidence for themselves. Prosecutor Walsh's closing was simple and powerful. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant used his position as a religious leader to systematically abuse vulnerable women for 15 years. The evidence is overwhelming, the pattern is clear, and the victims deserve justice. I ask you to hold Samuel Yoder accountable for his crimes and send a message that no one, regardless of their position or reputation, is above the law. As the jury filed out for deliberation, Miriam felt a profound sense of completion. Whatever the verdict, she had spoken her truth publicly and courageously. She had honored Sarah's memory and given the other survivors a voice. She had transformed from victim to advocate, from powerless to empowered. Caleb found her in the courthouse hallway afterward, pulling her into an embrace that conveyed all the pride and love he felt for the remarkable woman she had become. "You were incredible in there," he whispered against her hair. "Sarah would be so proud of you. I'm so proud of you." "It's not over yet," Miriam said, though she was smiling through her tears. "We still need a conviction. Whatever happens with the verdict," Caleb said firmly, "you've already won. You've already changed the world for every woman who watched you stand up to that bully and refused to be broken." As they waited for the jury to return, surrounded by the extended family they had built together, Miriam reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a terrified girl in a burlap sack to a confident woman demanding justice, the transformation seemed almost impossible to believe. But it had happened one day at a time, one act of courage at a time, one person choosing love over fear at a time. And whatever came next, she knew she would face it with the same strength and dignity that had carried her this far. 6 months after the verdict guilty on all counts, with elder Samuel Yoder sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, Miriam stood in the kitchen of their new farmhouse, watching through the window as Caleb taught Ella how to saddle their gentle mare, Buttercup. The Iowa countryside stretched endlessly before them, golden cornstalks swaying in the late afternoon breeze, and she could hardly believe this peaceful life was really hers. The media circus had died down gradually after the trial, though the case had sparked important conversations about abuse in closed religious communities across the country. Other women had come forward with similar stories from different Amish settlements, leading to additional investigations and prosecutions. The courage of one frightened girl on a dark road had rippled outward, creating waves of change that continued to spread. Dr. Chen had started a support network for survivors from traditional communities, with Miriam serving as a peer counselor for women making the difficult transition to independence. Rachel Lapp, now 18 and legally emancipated, was living with Dr. Chen while finishing her GED and planning to study social work. The other survivors were healing too, each in her own way, supported by the knowledge that they were no longer alone. The farmhouse they'd bought with money from Caleb's insurance settlement and Sarah's life insurance had been Sarah's dreamer place, where Ella could have a pony and room to run, where Caleb could return to farming on a smaller scale, where a family could grow in peace and safety. Miriam had initially felt guilty about moving into Sarah's dream home, but Caleb had convinced her that Sarah would have wanted her family, all of them, to be happy. "She always said this house needed children's laughter," he'd told Miriam when they first walked through the property. "She'd love knowing that Ella gets to grow up here, and she'd love knowing that you helped make it a home filled with love instead of grief." The guest room where Miriam had slept for their first months of marriage had been converted into a proper nursery, painted soft yellow and filled with furniture they'd chosen together. Their first biological child was due in 3 months, a reality that still amazed both of them. After years of believing she was too damaged for real love, Miriam was discovering the joy of creating new life within a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Ella, now 7 and seizure-free for 6 months thanks to a new medication, had adapted to their expanded family with characteristic grace. She called Miriam Mama without prompting, and spoke excitedly about teaching her little brother or sister to ride Buttercup and help with the garden. The trauma of the trial had faded, as children's trauma often does, replaced by the security of knowing she was loved and protected. Mrs. Kowalski had moved into the small apartment above their barn, officially to help with the farm, but really because none of them could imagine their family without her fierce loyalty and practical wisdom. She tended a vegetable garden that fed half the county and had become the unofficial grandmother to every child within 5 miles. "Miriam!" Ella called from the paddock. "Come see. I can brush Buttercup all by myself." Miriam walked outside, her hand resting on her growing belly, marveling again at the simple pleasure of being able to move freely in her own space without fear or restriction. The evening air was warm and sweet with the scent of honeysuckle, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark was singing its liquid song. Caleb looked up from adjusting Ella's stirrups, his face breaking into the easy smile that had become as familiar to Miriam as breathing. The grief lines around his eyes had softened into laugh lines, and the tension he'd carried for so long had been replaced by the contentment of a man whose life had found its proper rhythm again. "You're glowing," he said, walking over to kiss her cheek. "Pregnancy suits you." "Everything suits me these days," Miriam replied, leaning into his warmth. "Sometimes I can't believe this is really my life." "Believe it," Caleb said softly. "You've earned every bit of happiness you have." They stood together, watching Ella practice her riding, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The scared, scarred girl who had stumbled along a county road in the darkness felt like someone from another lifetime. Though Miriam knew she would always carry that girl's strength and resilience within her. "The adoption papers came through," Caleb said suddenly, pulling an envelope from his shirt pocket. "It's official. Ella is legally your daughter now, not just in our hearts." Miriam felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at the documents that made their unconventional family complete in the eyes of the law. "Does she know?" "I thought we could tell her together at dinner." Mrs. Kowalski made pierogi to celebrate. The kitchen table that evening was crowded with their chosen family: Caleb, Miriam, Ella, Mrs. Kowalski, Dr. Chen, who had driven out from town, and Rebecca Martinez, who had become not just their lawyer but their friend. The conversation flowed easily between English and Polish and Pennsylvania Dutch, with Ella translating when needed and everyone laughing at her creative interpretations. "I have some news to share," Caleb announced when the dinner dishes were cleared away. "Today, Miriam officially became Ella's legal mother, which means our family is complete in every way that matters." Ella's face lit up with pure joy. "Really? Miriam is really my mum now? Forever?" "Forever," Miriam confirmed, pulling the little girl onto her lap. "If that's what you want—" "Of course it's what I want," Ella declared. "I've been wanting it since the day you taught me to make bread without the scary mixer." The laughter that followed was rich and warm, the sound of people who had found each other against impossible odds and chosen to build something beautiful together. Dr. Chen raised her glass of apple cider in a toast. "To families that are created by love rather than obligation, to the courage to choose your own path, and to the wisdom to know that healing is always possible, even when the wounds seem too deep to mend." As the evening wound down and their guests prepared to leave, Miriam found herself on the front porch with Rebecca, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. "Any regrets?" Rebecca asked quietly. Miriam considered the question seriously. The path that had led her here had been painful and difficult, marked by losses that still ached when she thought about them too directly. Her relationship with her birth family was severed permanently, and she still grieved for the community and culture she'd been forced to leave behind. "I regret that it took so much pain to get here," she said finally. "I regret that Sarah had to die for the truth to come out. I regret that other women suffered because I stayed silent for so long. But do I regret the choices I made once I found the courage to make them? Never." "You changed the world, you know," Rebecca said. "Not just for the women who testified, but for every girl who will grow up knowing that religious authority doesn't mean the right to abuse, that speaking truth is more important than keeping peace, that there are people who will believe them and support them." "We changed the world," Miriam corrected gently. "None of us could have done it alone." Later that night, as she and Caleb lay in bed, listening to the peaceful sounds of their farm settling into sleep, Miriam reflected on the unexpected ways life could transform. The marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement for legal protection had become the deepest love either of them had ever known. The refuge they'd created for one frightened girl had become a sanctuary for an entire extended family. The act of speaking truth about abuse had become a mission to protect and empower other survivors. "Caleb," she said softly in the darkness. "Thank you." "For what?" "For stopping that night, for seeing someone who needed help instead of someone who might cause trouble, for choosing compassion over caution." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I should thank you too." "For what?" "For teaching me that healing doesn't mean forgetting, for showing me that love multiplies instead of divides, for proving that broken people can create something whole and beautiful together." Miriam smiled in the darkness, her hand resting on her belly where their child grew safe and wanted. Outside, the Iowa wind whispered through the cornstalks, carrying the scent of rich earth and growing things. Somewhere in the barn, Mrs. Kowalski was probably checking on the animals one last time. In her pink bedroom, Ella slept peacefully, dreaming of ponies and picnics and all the adventures tomorrow might bring. This was what sanctuary looked like, Miriam realized. Not a place where pain never touched you, but a place where you were strong enough to survive it and wise enough to help others do the same. A place where love was freely given and gratefully received, where truth was valued more than comfort, where every person was seen as worthy of protection and respect. The girl in the burlap sack had been looking for escape. The woman she'd become had found something infinitely better, a home where she could be completely herself, surrounded by people who loved her not in spite of her scars, but because of the strength they represented. As sleep began to claim her, Miriam whispered a prayer of gratitude for dark roads that led to unexpected light, for strangers who became family, for the mysterious ways that one person's courage could ripple outward to change the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve others who needed hope. But tonight, she was simply a woman in love with her life, grateful beyond measure for the journey that had brought her home.